Learn in Sicha about unity and separation, basically about kilayim. Kilayim, the catch-all category of things that individually are permitted, but together, when they're mixed together, they're forbidden. So you could call it forbidden mixtures, but you have to include the part that individually they're permitted. Together, they're forbidden. Because if you remember, we'll just skip ahead for a second. We saw the example of a nazir. Can he dip bread into wine? So you could call that a mixture. It's not the same thing because the bread is permitted to the nazir, the wine is not. So it's not two things that are permitted that are being mixed together. It's one thing that's permitted and forbidden being mixed together. So that's not called kilayim, even though we established a principle there about meat and milk. But anyways, going back to this. So the Torah tells us very specifically, there's 3 verses that say, don't sow a variety of species in your vineyard, like don't just be tossing seeds around, don't plow with an ox and donkey together, don't wear a mixture of wool and linen, that is shatnez. Right after that, it tells us to put tzitzis on our garments. 3 verses followed by the 4th verse. Why is it 2 next to each other? Because for tzitzis, there's an exception / mitzvah for shatnez. And then also when it comes to the clothing of the priest in the temple, there's also an exception / mitzvah for shatnez, which is avnet, the belt. There is another verse of the Torah from a different Parsha that puts all 3 together, and it describes it a little bit differently. It doesn't say don't plow together. It says don't crossbreed, don't graft, essentially, and then also don't wear shatnez. It's wool and linen together. Whatever that entails is in commentaries, but as far as the Torah is concerned, it's the same line. We saw different things about that, and then one of the things that we saw is that there's actually another category of kilayim, which we wouldn't necessarily think it was kilayim, because it's not mentioned together with it, and that is meat and milk is a kind of kilayim also, because meat by itself is kosher. Well, as long as it's kosher, it's kosher. Milk by itself is kosher, it's kosher. Mixing it together is forbidden. So that's kilayim, and that maybe we would have thought that was permitted, but we see a verse from the Torah explicitly tells us, shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. That's what we know is forbidden. The details of what we're going through about we would have thought, we could have thought, etc., is eventually what's going to lead us to the full answer of the Sichos. So we're not there yet to understand why we're approaching from this direction. We just realize that part of saying we would have thought, we could have thought is part of what our eventual answer is going to be. Now, we saw from the Shalom, who's mentioned the Rekanati, who's the Italian Kabbalist, that talks about when you're mixing meat and milk together, you're mixing up what's going up on high. That's the attributes of justice and mercy, and you're mixing it up, and justice is going to dilute mercy, and we don't want that. So that's more of a Kabbalistic approach of why we don't want to mix it together. Obviously, we don't mix it because God says don't, but there's other stuff going on there, which is something that we've learned extensively about, especially if we go back to the Michamocha Mimer. But now we're understanding how there's a through line between the physical world and the highest of spiritual realms, and whatever we're doing down here, stuff is getting mixed up there. So think about a rope. What happens at the bottom of the rope affects the top of the rope. That's your through line. Things are getting mixed up. We see that extended to the rest of Kilayim also. We see the commentary of Ramban and Rebbe Bachya that say God made certain species, and it's not your job to start creating new species. Saying you're like, God, I love the stuff you made, but come on, let's make new stuff. No, we don't even know how many categories of things there exist in the world. We don't even know. We don't know the extent of creation. We're busy, we're going to invent new stuff. And it's not just a matter of saying, you're mixing up the works of creation. Mix up the works of creation down here, mixes up stuff up above. Because remember, like we saw, there's not a blade of grass that doesn't grow without a mazel, which high enough up looks like an angel telling it to grow. So if you're going to start mixing stuff up, you're going to cross wires. Angels can't do their jobs. So you're going to cause chaos up above. We all know that things don't work properly if people don't know what their job is and they're not allowed to do their job. So that's where it comes in. The Rebbe Bachya explains that kilayim, Kaf Lamed Aleph, comes to the word of restraint. So the same way that Beis HaKel is the jail, it's a restrictive place. It says, Lo sichla rachem bechem meni, don't withhold compassion, your mercy from me. That's what King David says in Psalms. So we see that it's restraining. It cannot be what it is meant to be when you restrain it. God made an orange. He wants the orange to be an orange. He doesn't want us to take the orange and make a Frankenstein creature out of it. God made a lion. He wants the lion to be a lion. Now, take this and see what you can make out of it. The world is not a science experiment in that regard. You're going to mix stuff up above, and it's going to be chaos. People, angels, nobody can do their job if things just a mush. First thing, clear your desk. First thing, clean your room. And now you can approach whatever your big project is. You have to have order in things. So don't be mixing stuff up. The little correction that we have, and this is the correction that we have is because the translation added a little bit of commentary. I skimmed through the translations, but obviously I don't always catch everything. So we were talking about Cain and Hevel, Cain and Abel. We mentioned something about the snake and Adam and whatever. That's not in the original commentary. Rabbi Bachya says it's one comes from the spirit of evil, one comes from the spirit of holiness, Kedusha. And we're supposed to go after holiness, and we see what happens when the two of them mix. And then I was trying to follow the line through. Is Rabbi Bachya giving this as commentary? He's basing it on something else. There is a Medrash Tanchuma that speaks about the idea that because Cain brought a very not good sacrifice, it says from the ground. So instead of bringing the choices of everything, he brought flax, and not even like the best of the flax. So flax makes linen. In the meantime, Abel brought the best of his flock. God is saying, this sinners, this guy's carbon should be mixed with this exemplary carbon. So let's not mix the two. And that's where showing in a Kabbalistic sense, you have already wool and linen don't mix. So and if you try to force it when it's not coming from a holy place, because that we kind of started seeing already, when it's not coming from an absolute place of submission, when you try to force it, then it has fatal consequences. And we see see the two of them, they couldn't live in the world together. Anyways, the general idea is that was just a correction. I know I had snake in the translation. It's not in the original commentary, so I don't know where they got that from. I don't know for sure, but it could be that just because the snake is indicative, the embodiment of evil in this like Edenic kind of state. So it could be it was harkening back to that, not just literally saying that king came from the snake. Anyways, moving on. It goes into more about the idea of chukim. A chuk is something that the king decrees and you just keep it because he said so. Not because there's no reason for it, but he doesn't give us the reason for it. He doesn't have to give the people the reason for it. So that's why we call these a chuk. We started learning that there's more that are involved in it because we saw the idea, it says the nation of the world will mock you for this, specifically for shatnez. We also saw what else is considered part of the chukim, the red heifer, the paraduma, because the person who does the whole process of preparing it to purify others because it's impure himself. Scapegoat, goat that's pushed to Azazel, the person also has to go be purified. The whole thing doesn't make sense. And then we saw Rambam saying, from Mar Nevuchim, so Guide to the Perplexed, trying to give us more of this philosophical approach to why this would be forbidden. And Rambam brings in the idea that animals don't crossbreed on their own. Like we were saying, you don't just in the wild, there's not all these Frankenstein creatures that exist in the wild. Some weird hybrid creatures just coming out of the wild because they were told from the beginning, Limbi Nehu, according to its kind. You have the power of reproduction, but you reproduce according to your kind. If you're trying to mess that up, then there's not going to be any reproduction, and that's the end of your species. That's what Ramban tells us is coded into creation. So the only way that doesn't happen is if man kind of interferes with it. Plants don't naturally graft, and animals don't naturally crossbreed. It's only if man comes to force it. So Rambam says the whole idea of crossbreeding, because man has to force it, means that you have to be watching this process take place. And what are you doing? That's not what you're supposed to be doing with yourself. You're not supposed to be sitting and trying to force these animals and watch them mate. Don't do that. That's a vulgar thing for you to be doing. Stay away from that stuff. What we ended up with last time, because it's the recurrent question of why is shatnez different? Why does shatnez have exemptions / commandments? Because when it comes to tzitzis and when it comes to the belt of the priests in the Beis HaMikdash, the thing about shatnez, the thing that's distinctive about shatnez is that even if somebody combines wool and linen together, it can still be taken apart afterwards. It does not create a new entity, which is different than the other kinds of mixtures. If you graft a new species, Ramban says you won't be able to, but if in theory you did, if in theory you grafted something new, you can't separate it afterwards. You can't take a tangelo and separate the pomelo from the tangerine. Whether or not that's kilayim, I don't know, because it's citrus, but still, you can't remove the pomelo from it afterwards. You've created now something new. This new thing is a tangelo. If you take a donkey and a horse and you put it together and you get a mule, you can't remove the horse from the mule. You've created now a new entity. There's no longer horse and donkey, now there is only mule. And that even goes back to meat and milk together. Because according to the Torah, you could soak them together, even though the rabbi said you can't. Because if you soak it together, technically you can still wash the milk off afterwards. It's only once you cook the meat in the milk that you can't then separate one from the other. Because now you've, in a way, created a new entity. You know, when you're dealing with kids and they're like, but I don't like that one. And you're like, pick it out. You gotta get them sound like, I don't like the cucumbers. You're like, so just don't eat them. Pick them out. Versus if in the dough, let's say you give them a bread that has herbs in it, they're like, I don't like the green things. Like, pick it out. Like, that's not happening, okay? You can't just start picking the rosemary out of the dough. No. Again, Shauna's on the other hand, if you weave something out of wool and linen, if you sew it together, you could actually separate it afterwards. If you have wool and linen together, what is the name of that material? We don't necessarily have a name for that. It's just 50%, 60-40, whatever. It's not a new entity that's been created. You might have made a new garment, but we don't have a name for having sewn these two pieces together. Right there is a clue about why one has exceptions and one doesn't. This is now for the Gemara of Nida. Ravacha, son of Rabbi Yeva, said in the name of Mar Zutra, so we're getting quotes in the names of, in the case of one who put a thread of flax in a cloak of wool and it fell out, but it does not know whether it all fell out or whether it did not all fall out, it's permitted to wear the cloak. Wool and linen is talking about. Flax is linen. The Gemara asks, what is the reason that the halacha is lenient in this case of uncertainty? So why are we lenient about this if it's prohibited? By Torah law it is written diverse kinds shatnez, and this is interpreted as an acronym indicating that the halacha of diverse kinds does not apply unless the item is comb smooth, so shua, spun tavoy as a thread, and woven nuz. Remember we said the word shatnez is an acronym for 3 different ways of combining the materials together. Without these characteristics, the combination is not considered diverse kinds by Torah law. So if it wasn't comb / smooth together, spun as a thread, woven together, then it's not necessarily considered shatnez. So this is just somebody put in a thread of flax / linen into the wool cloak, but it wasn't done in these ways necessarily, so we're lenient. And it is the sages who decree that diverse kinds that are merely attached to each other are prohibited, despite the fact that they are not combed and spun together. So the Torah says these 3 ways, and the rabbis added on to the prohibition that it's any way of combining it. But because it's coming from the rabbis, there's leniency in this kind of uncertainty. You kind of understand the difference, that sometimes the way we approach what happens next depends on where the halacha comes from. What we're looking at is why is there a leniency in this thing of shatnez? There's not leniency in grafting. You either grafted or you didn't graft. That's kind of like the meat and milk thing. According to Torah law, shatnez is an acronym for 3 kinds of combining threads, materials, etc. So anything that falls outside of that would be a rabbinic prohibition. So it is still prohibited, but the prohibition is coming from the rabbis versus coming from the Torah. The prohibition is still the prohibition, but what happens next is affected by where the prohibition is coming from. You can't only follow the written Torah without the oral Torah. So that's clear. But if someone was misguided enough to think that it was possible, you would say, well, the Torah just says don't cook it, it doesn't say don't marinate meat and milk. The sages tell us, no, it's actually forbidden. You can't actually marinate it either. You can't combine it. And once we're at it, don't even put fake milk on the table. You're not even supposed to be putting like almond milk on a table that has meat on it. If you baked it into something, whatever, but you shouldn't just have a cup of almond milk if you're eating meat. It doesn't look right. So the sages say just don't do that stuff. It's not that it's prohibited because the almond milk is not real milk. You shouldn't be getting into the habit of doing this kind of stuff. So that's what the sages say. So it's still forbidden. You still can't marinate meat and milk, but the prohibition is coming from a different place. Why is that important? Only because of what happens afterwards. The rectification, if somebody has crossed it, or when it comes to leniencies, it's different. Because usually, I don't know, can't say every single case ever, usually it seems to be that when it is a Torah mitzvah, clearly delineated by the Torah, we're usually stricter than when it's a rabbinic, as in what comes next, how strict it's going to be, depends on where it's coming from. So they're saying, why is there leniency? They're saying there's leniency because even though this was still forbidden, but the prohibition is coming from the sages versus coming from the Torah, there's an opening for some leniency there. As an after effect, not as a before thing, as an after thing. So don't do it from the outset, but if it happened and this, we can be a little bit more lenient with this. And in this case, since he does not know if it all fell out, it is permitted, as Allah is lenient with regard to uncertainties involving prohibitions that are by rabbinic law. So that's what we're just explaining. That wherever the law is coming from, the prohibition is still the prohibition, but the after effects of what do we do next, there is more leniency when it comes to rabbinic law than when it comes to Torah law. That's all that it's saying. So here it's saying, I think it's all out, I'm not sure. The rabbis say, because of the way it was put in, there is leniency here. And that's why you need the oral law. You can't practice the written law without the oral law. It's literally not possible. I don't know what Judaism you're practicing at that point. It's not Judaism. When Moshe came with the Torah, he explained it. That's where the oral law comes from. Think about when you're going through an album and your parents have a story for every photo in the album. Transfer that. Moshe said this is the verse and this is what the verse means. If you follow the written law without the oral law, we'd literally be taking people's eyes out. Whatever you come up with afterwards, the sages can discuss the law and the majority is going to rule. But whatever they rule cannot contradict what's actually written in the Torah. The oral law does often argue on the interpretation of the Torah. God has entrusted us to enact that argument and the majority will rule. But the ruling will not contradict what is actually written in the Torah. It will just elaborate on what is there. These and these are both correct. How could Hillel and Shammai are both correct? But the law has to follow one of them. Even though we follow Hillel most of the time, in some way Shammai is more correct in a lot of stuff. But it doesn't matter because the law is following Hillel. In that case, the law follows Hillel because we go with the more lenient approach. We're humans living in a physical world. Torah is way more in tune to creation, obviously, than people angry or ignorant. They're not listening. They don't know. People just don't know. Okay, continuing on, Rashi objects to this leniency. There's a disagreement there. One could say that by Torah law it is prohibited if the linen and wool are either combed or spun or woven. Perhaps the word shanis does not limit the prohibition to a combination of all three activities, but to any one of them, as in anything that's going to combine them. The Gemara concludes, and the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Mar Zutra, from the fact that the merciful one expresses the prohibition in the Torah in one word, therefore the term means all three characteristics together. Actually, what we've now discovered is that the Torah says shanis, it's all three of them together. It's not one of each of them, it's all three together. And Ravashi says, no, maybe it's only one of them. There's a disagreement here, and they say no. Gemara says it goes according to Mar Zutra that it's all three together. Why? Because God said it all in one word, shanis. Now, Ramban, Veged Kilayim shanis, that there shall not come upon you a garment of Kilayim of shanis. This is from the verses that we've been seeing. Why is it stated here? As in, why is this appearing in one verse versus another verse? Since in Devarim 22:11, quote further on, it is more explicitly stated. It says, there shall not come upon your garment Kilayim shanis. Versus those silba shanis tamer pishtim yachtav, don't wear shanis, wool and linen together. That's the first thing we ever saw. So we're looking at why is it different the way the wording of the prohibition. Because it said there you should not wear shanis, wool, and linen together. That's a very clear sentence. I might think that one is not to wear the loose pieces of wool, shearings, and stalks of flax. Can we not make a macaroni necklace with wool and linen together? What does it mean to wear them together? Scripture therefore states a garment, thus excluding the wearing of loose pieces of wool and flax not woven together into a garment. Whence do I know to include felted stuff of linen and wool, which though not spun and woven are pressed into one material and worn as a garment? Felt, if it would be made of wool and linen together. Scripture therefore says, Shan is that which is shua, comb, tavoy, spun, and nuz twisted together. That's the acronym of shatnez. And I say that the word nuz is an expression for materials which are compressed and twined one with the other to be joined into a coherent web. This is Rashi's language. So Ramban brought us to Rashi, who explains what does this word mean. But it does not appear to be correct. Now Ramban is disagreeing with Rashi. Just because we're not in the Gemara doesn't mean the rabbis can't disagree with each other. For felted stuff of linen and wool is not forbidden by law of the Torah, but only by enactment of the rabbis. We say it's a different way of combining materials. Since it is only combed but not spun and twisted, so why did Rashi include it under shatnez? Since that word implies all three actions, combing, spinning, and twisting. That's what we saw in the Gemara. And so we have been taught in the Mishnah, felted stuff of wool and linen is forbidden because it is combed, which clearly indicates that it's not spun and twisted. So what if it's only one but not all three? If it doesn't have all three qualifications of shatnez. And in the Gemara, the rabbis have said, perhaps I might say, that scripture prohibited wool and linen if they were only combed or spun or twisted. And the Gemara came to the conclusion, this we just saw the Gemara, the final law is as Mar Zutra, who said that this scriptural prohibition applies only if all three acts were done, not if only one of them. Since the merciful one expressed them all in one term. We saw that. Shatnez is mentioned mention a combination of 3 words. But the Braita taught in the Tar Kohanim stating, I know only that a garment must not be worn if made of wool and linen together, but once do I know to include felted stuff? Felted we're saying is stuff that's pressed together. If it's combed but not spun and twisted. From that which states Shatnez, that Braita intends to include things which are not a garment on the basis of the verse, you shall not wear mingled stuff, mixed together stuff. Since the word garment is not mentioned there, one says, Uveged Kalayim Shatnez, a garment of Kalayim that's Shatnez. Don't wear that. The other verse says, don't wear Shatnez, wool and linen together. It doesn't specify the word garment. So what if I want to make a friendship bracelet out of wool and linen? Is that a garment? Can I make a purse that has it? Can I also have a belt, like the Kohanim? So you see that extends beyond just wearing an actual garment. But it does not intend to teach, as Rashi interpreted it, that wool and linen, even if only combed but not spun and twisted, are already forbidden as Shatnez. This interpretation of the Torah Kohanim, so that's another commentary, is a basic principle, since even an article which is not a garment, if worn as a vestment, is also forbidden by law of the Torah to be made of wool and linen, such as where one plaits threads of wool and linen. That takes out the friendship bracelet, by the way, and makes of them a belt or anything similar, providing only that the threads are combed, spun, and twisted. The Torah Kohanim mentioned felted stuffs merely as biblical support for rabbinical enactment, since these are forbidden only by the law of the rabbis, as they are not a garment, because the 2 diverse materials are only combed but not spun and twisted. So the rabbis have prohibited even one that's only one, even though it's not all 3. Similarly, in respect of that which Rashi wrote with reference to combing, that the wool and linen must also be compressed and twisted together. In a similar manner, he also wrote in his commentaries to the Gemara. Other scholars have already commented that Rashi's interpretation is not in accord with what the rabbis have said in the Talmud. You must deduce from this that the upper knots of the tzitzit are required by scriptural law. For if you should think that they are not required by scriptural law, why then did the merciful one have to state a specific permission for using mingled stuff of wool and linen in tzitzis? As in, all the explanation, why do we need to establish permission that tzitzis can be Shatnez? It's a short version of what's being said here. Do we not hold the law to be established that if one fastens 2 pieces together with only one stitch, it is not considered joined? Because the whole idea of tzitzis is that you're pulling strings into the garment. You're not weaving the strings into the garment. The strings are the fringes. The whole system of how you knot it, because you have to get to 613 in the numbers over there. So, okay, so there's a system of knotting it, but I knotted it. I didn't comb, weave, etc. It's not the same combination as if I put the bolt in a loom together. I didn't make a belt out of it. I tied it onto it. Yet, we have to have an exemption for having tied it onto it, which seems to explain that there's more to this prohibition than just wearing my poncho that's made out of wool and linen together. Thus, the rabbis of the Talmud have revealed to us that a garment made of linen in which wool and tzitzis have been tied with 2 knots constitutes kalayim by law of the Torah, even though they have not been compressed and twined together. Exclamation point. Ramban is saying, what's going on? Let's get the details of all this, because we got to know what we're doing. Remember, we got the blueprint. We have rabbis. They have to figure out everything God's saying. We have to know. We have to know what God's saying. We want to know too. We just aren't as in tune to it as the great rabbis are. Rather, the matter is as follows. Scripture has stated, the Torah states, neither shall there come upon you a garment, kalayim shatnez, veged kalayim shatnez, beged is a garment, meaning to say that every garment that is made of a thread, any thread, which has been combed, spun, and twisted, we should not wear if it is kalayim. That is of mingled stuff, so they mix together. And the book of Devarim explained, in addition, that we should not wear anything which is combed, spun, and twisted of wool and linen if they be together. That is to say, if the wool and linen are joined together with at least 2 stitches. So it's not the thread that's being combined, they're being combined in a garment. Do you understand the difference? If, for example, one had yarn and they were to knit or crochet with the yarn, let's say, for example, and you can make all kinds of stuff. If I get yarn made out of wool, some of it's probably synthetic. Oh, acrylic, yeah, that's right. A real woolen yarn, and I want to knit a blanket. Can I attach pieces of linen to that blanket? If I want to make a sweater, can I put a linen patch on the sweater? So we have many questions. First, we thought that shatnez is not worded differently, but actually what we're seeing is the language shatnez is worded differently. So one part of the Torah, it says don't wear a garment. A garment seems to indicate that somehow the 2 have been combined, but it's individually were combined, versus where it says don't wear woolen together, that means that at a thread level it was combined. The actual thread is a combination of wool and linen. That is an important distinction, because if we say don't wear it at the thread level, as in your woolen yarn that you're going to make your blanket or your sweater out of, make sure it's only made out of wool and no linen was stuck in there for whatever reason. Versus if it's just the garment and I can't put linen on top of my wool garment as a patch or something, that's different. The reason why we see that it includes both is because the Torah tells us tzitzis can be shatnez. So why would the Torah tell us that? The fringes of the tzitzis are not woven from a thread made out of shatnez, but it's saying if you have a linen garment and you're putting wool threads on it, Torah is exempting that because the prohibition does apply to something like that as well. That's not happening at the thread level, that's happening at the garment level. So both of those are prohibited, and that's what that's explaining to us. This means to say that even if the wool and linen were each combed, spun, and twisted separately, they may not be attached together, for when they are joined they constitute kalayim. So it's the joining in some format that makes it kalayim. Just as he said there, you should not plow with an oxen and donkey together. When we saw about the animals, it said don't plow them together, and then a different verse said don't crossbreed. The prohibition began even earlier than the crossbreeding. It said don't even bother plowing with them together. The commentaries, Ramban and Rabbeinu Bachai, said then you're going to stable them together and they're going to end up crossbreeding. The Torah doesn't give you that thought process. The Torah just says don't plow with them together. That's it. That's what the Torah says. Different verse says don't crossbreed. So here it's a similar idea that it's saying for Shanas, and also one it's saying don't actually wear them in a garment together, and the other was don't combine them at the thread level together. That is to say if they're tied and joined to each other. And in the case of garments, fastening with 2 stitches already constitutes joining them. It being derived by the rabbis from the word together, that 2 stitches constitute a joining together. So 1 stitch, not tight enough. 2 stitches, now it's joined. From there, the verse in Devarim where the word garment is not mentioned, as it is here in Vayikra and Parshas Kedoshim, the rabbis have learned that mingled stuff is forbidden, although they are not in a garment, but even if one plaited threads of thick material and made of them belts, although they were not woven for vestment, similar to what we were taught in the Mishnah, one may not tie a cord of wool onto one made of linen in order to bind up the loins. And the expression nuz in the word shatnez is a shortened word in this composite term, just like the word tavoy spun, of which there's only the letter tet in the word shatnez because it's an acronym, so it doesn't have everything. And the meaning of the word nuz is, in my opinion, like the word naloz, which is perversion of the expressions. Naloz, the perversion, is an abomination. Hashem, meaning he who turns aside and perverts his paths. Unaloizim, and perverse in their paths, meaning those who are crooked and turn aside unto their crooked ways. For anything which is spun like a thread is turned and crooked. Tavas Hashem naloz. This is similar to what we are taught in the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon says the meaning of shan is that he who disregards this law is perverse and turns his Father in heaven against him. Meaning to say that the glorious name turns away his merciful ways from him, similar to what is said, but with a crooked one, you deal crookedly. That's Tehillim. And in the language of the sages, this word naloz is used in a shortened form. Thus, this can be compared to a king's son. Shenuz, his heart upon him, and he took a digging tool to undermine his father's house. The king's son taking a digging tool to undermine his father's house, it's kind of like cutting off your nose to spite your face kind of idea. Shenuz, meaning that he turned his heart to an evil path. It is of the same root as the word naloz in its shortened form nuz. That the sages have said in the Talmud and Tractate Sanhedrin, meniz yaseh. Of the master, we could not have answered him at all. That is to say, if you had wanted to insist and turn away the matter from the right course. So saying it's a language of turning away. So we're having a etymology course right now. We would not have known how to answer you at all. Niz yaseh is thus like nazi yaseh. That is to say, his turning away from the correct path. This is the true and correct interpretation of this matter of shatnez. It was for this reason that it was necessary for the Torah to grant permission for kilayim, the mixtures of stuff, and tzitzis, although the tzitzis are not plaited and do not constitute a garment. So here we're going to a deeper thing. It's not just, remember we said, why are these 2 verses next to each other? Any 2 subjects could be next to each other. Oh, because tzitzis is permitted. But here, Ramban is asking, why does tzitzis have to be permitted? You didn't weave them together in a thread. So say because actually it's also forbidden. This then is the law of the Torah, i.e. if the linen garment was made of threads, which were comb spun and twisted, and the woolen threads were likewise comb spun and twisted, not necessarily together, but each one individually, then these 2 kinds of threads must not be joined together. So each one individually, each material individually was done, you can't put them together. However, the sages prohibited even if the threads were only made in one way, either combed or spun or twisted. The sages eventually say it's not only all 3 together, it's only one of them. It is for this reason that we have been taught in the Mishnah, felted stuff of wool and linen is forbidden because it is combed, and edging of wool on a linen garment is forbidden since it interlaces the web of the garment. All these are prohibited by the law of the rabbis. So the rabbinical prohibition is just don't put them together at all. Even if it's just piping and stuff, you can't do that. The next time you buy like a woolen suit or something, it's a real thing, you actually have to check that there's no linen in the garment or on the garment. Now the reason for the prohibition of mingled stuff in garments, so kilayim, is in order to keep far away from the mixing together of different species. Remember, you can't mix stuff up. You can't just invent new species. You can't Frankenstein stuff. And he therefore prohibited the threads, i.e. wool and linen, from which garments are usually made. But Rambam had said in Moreh Nevuchim that the reason for the prohibition, Moreh Nevuchim is the guide for the perplexed. By the way, I think I heard myself in one of the recordings, I translated Moreh Nevuchim instead of guide for the perplexed, guide to the perplexed. That the reason for the prohibition of wearing a garment made of wool and linen is because at that time this kind of garment was used by the priests and magicians to adorn themselves when performing their activities. And Rambam says that he found it's so written in their books. So there's more that we didn't see necessarily about this from Moreh Nevuchim. When we say priests and magicians, we're talking about idolaters. We're not talking about our Kohanim, we're talking about idolaters. L'chamrei balei kshafim. And since this was for them a matter of great importance and very much desired by them in order that they should do their activities in honor of the idols and demons, therefore the Torah removed it from being worn by all people, since the Torah intends to blot out their deeds and efface their memory. We went through a whole explanation of what is exactly is prohibited. Ramban brings in a new aspect of Rambam. Moreh Nevuchim, guide for the perplexed, is something that gives a more philosophical approach to things. It's supposed to be a more, quote unquote, more palatable gateway into Torah study. We saw that when he talks about don't crossbreed, he says, because you have to watch it if you're going to crossbreed, and that's vulgar, don't do that. So here, we didn't see the original Moreh Nevuchim, but Ramban is bringing in Rambam to say that in Moreh Nevuchim, Rambam explains that wearing wool and linen together was something that priests and magicians did, basically sorcerers sorcerers, you think of it like that, idolaters. Idolaters and the magic mans, black magic people did that. So because they did it in service of their idolatrous stuff, God doesn't want us to have any contact with that, so God said, don't do it, don't wear it at all. That's not explicitly stated in the Torah, that's commentary. The Rambam Hilchos Kilayim, Rambam the laws of Kilayim. When a ewe is born to a she-goat, one is not liable for mixing its wool with linen. It is, however, forbidden according to rabbinic decree, because of the impression it creates. If wool and linen are connected in any manner, they're considered mixed fabrics according to scriptural law. What is implied when wool and linen were mixed together, combed together, made into a smooth mass, they're considered as mixed fabrics. That's why we just saw that whole explanation. If they were mixed and combed as one, and then a garment was woven from this combed fabric, they're considered mixed fabric. So what exactly does Kilayim Shatnez, what does it entail? If one sewed woolen fabric to linen, even if you sewed them with silk, you're knitting a blanket, and I want to combine the pieces with silk. I didn't combine woolen linen with woolen linen. I'm combining woolen linen with another material. So there's a separation now. I made something new. Sewed a woolen garment with linen thread, or a linen garment with woolen thread. One tied woolen threads with linen threads, or braided them together, or even if one placed woolen linen together in a sack or basket and wound them, they're considered as mixed fabrics. Rambam says any combination that puts them together, which we just saw from Ramban, 2 stitches is considered together. That's all prohibited. Even if one tied a braid of wool to a braid of linen. I braided wool and I braided linen. Can I just smash them together? No. Very important stuff for everybody to know. This law also applies if one folded over wool and linen fabric and tied them together. The rationale is that the proof text states wool and linen together. So the original verse we saw is wool and linen together. It doesn't specify what makes them together. So here the rabbis are coming to explain what together actually entails. Since they are combined, regardless of how they are forbidden. Rambam puts his foot down. He says any sort of combination is forbidden, no matter how they are put together. That leads us to the end of section 3.